Beekner was my 8th grade earth science teacher. Mrs. Beekner was an amazing teacher, and one of the reasons I know she was an amazing teacher is because I still remember some of what she taught me even to this day. Last weekend, Chris and I were rearranging some furniture in our house, and so I was rearranging my desk, and I happened to find this little handout that Mrs. Beekner had given me in 8th grade earth science. And I still remember Mrs. Beekner teaching us about the phases of the moon. And so I put this picture up here for you this morning to show you what my little handout taught me from Mrs. Beekner about the different cycles of the moon. And the cycles of the moon always begin with what we call the new moon. That's the period of time when the moon is positioned perfectly between the earth and the sun, that the moon blocks out the rays from the sun, and so none of the sun's rays can reflect off the moon, so we can't actually see the moon from Earth. And if you've ever been outside, away from all the artificial light on a new moon night, especially a cloudy new moon night when you can't see any stars, you have experienced some pretty tangible, thick darkness. And sometimes, in those really dark nights, we can begin to doubt or wonder, if only for a second, if the sun will ever rise again. This summer, as we have been journeying through the Gospel of John together, we have seen this cosmic battle between light and dark. In fact, the author of John's Gospel is really upfront and honest about this battle and lets us know about the battle between light and darkness in the very beginning of the Gospel of John, in John chapter 1, verse 5. That the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness does not overcome it. The author of the Gospel of John tells us that the light is going to win. But as we've been reading through this Gospel this summer, it doesn't always seem like the light is winning. And this morning, we're going to look at 2 chapters in the Gospel of John that I think are some of the darkest chapters in the whole book. And we're going to journey through these chapters this morning to look at Jesus' journey through darkness, his journey toward the cross. And at the end of that journey, we're going to ask 2 questions. 2 questions that I asked us as we began this sermon series. Who is Jesus? And who are we? What can we learn about Jesus and about ourselves, even in the darkest night? So if you have your Bibles with you, I invite you to pull those out and turn with me to the beginning of John chapter 18, as we will journey through this together. This journey begins when Jesus and his disciples are in a garden. It's a place where they had often gone together and hung out, and it was evening time. All of the disciples were there with Jesus except for one, except for Judas. But Judas knew that Jesus and his disciples often hung out in this garden, and so Judas came with this band of police and soldiers from the chief priests and the Pharisees and came to the garden looking for Jesus. And so when this band of police and come together and approach Jesus, Jesus steps forward and says to them, "Who are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." This simple yet powerful answer is enough to get Jesus bound and arrested. And so this band of betrayers takes Jesus from the garden to go visit Annas. Annas is a very powerful force to be reckoned with. He's not the current high priest, that's Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the current high priest at this time. That's actually Annas' son-in-law. But Annas had served as the high priest just directly before Caiaphas. And not only did his son-in-law succeed him as the high priest, but so did 5 of his sons and 1 of his grandsons. It's not a stretch to say that Annas was one of the most influential and powerful figures of the high priestly family during this time. And so he's the first one to interrogate Jesus. And after he'd finished interrogating Jesus, he sent Jesus and that band of betrayers on to Caiaphas, his son-in-law, the current high priest. And then Caiaphas takes his turn cross-examining Jesus. And while Caiaphas is questioning Jesus, Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, is outside of Caiaphas' residence, warming himself by a fire. And Peter then denies that he even knows Jesus 3 times. And then the rooster crows. Caiaphas sends Jesus on to Pilate because there was a rule that the Jewish people couldn't actually crucify anyone. That was up to Rome to do. So if you wanted someone crucified, you had to get Rome to do it. So Caiaphas sends Jesus on to Pilate, hoping that Pilate will crucify him. And so when Jesus gets to Pilate, Pilate questions him and summons him kind of reluctantly. But in the process, Pilate learns some important things about Jesus. In John 19, verse 5, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw it, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God." Pilate is a little shocked to find out that Jesus has claimed to be the Son of God, and so he's nervous. On Pilate. We see them continue to press in on Pilate in verse 12. The Jews cried out to Pilate, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." Here, the Jewish religious leaders are trying to manipulate and force Pilate's hand. They're saying to Pilate, "Pilate, this man claimed to be a king, and anyone who claims to be a king is a direct threat to the Emperor Caesar. And if the emperor finds out that you did not crucify this man who claimed to be a king, then you are going to be in trouble with the emperor. In fact, we're going to make sure that Caesar knows that you didn't crucify this man. And when Caesar finds out, you're going to lose your cushy governmental job, and you're no longer going to be our Roman governor." So the Jewish leaders are pushing in on Pilate, and he pushes back faintly one last time. But then, in what I think is one of the darkest moments in these 2 chapters, the Jewish leaders reply with this in verse 14. "Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the Jews, 'Here is your king.' And they cried out, 'Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!' Pilate asked them, 'Shall I crucify your king?' The chief priest answered, 'We have no king but the emperor.' Then he handed him over to them to be crucified." Here is such a dark moment of betrayal and denial. Because here you have the chief priests, the religious rulers of the people of Israel, the very people who had given their lives to follow God and to teach others about God, the very religious rulers publicly denying their allegiance and their faith in God. They publicly say, "We have no king but the emperor." For thousands of years, the Jewish people had held to this belief that there was no God but the one true God of Israel. That one true God was the sovereign king and ruler of the whole universe. That they wouldn't bow down or give their allegiance to anyone but the one true God. But here in this moment, they're willing to reject that belief in order to get Jesus, who claimed to be the very Son of God, crucified. You see, these leaders wanted nothing more than to see Jesus nailed on a Roman cross, so they were willing to give up the core tenet of their faith in order to see that happen. That they would publicly deny and reject their faith to see Jesus crucified. And they got what they wanted. Jesus was nailed on a Roman cross and was lifted up. there was a sign posted above his head that Pilate had written that said in all 3 languages of the region where Jesus was crucified, that it read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Jesus was lifted up on this Roman cross, and he got thirsty. And there was a jar of sour wine at the foot of the cross, and it was filled with a sponge and then put on a hyssop plant and lifted up to Jesus' mouth. And when Jesus received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. In this moment, darkness won. That Jesus, the man who claimed to be the Son of God, the light of the world, was crucified, died on a Roman cross. And this was the darkest moment in human history. I think sometimes in our lives, we too have really dark moments. Dark moments when it seems like the darkness is winning. We might try to have faith and hope and believe that the light is going to win, but sometimes it doesn't seem like that. It seems so dark that it seems like the darkness is winning. And in those moments, it can seem so hopeless and we can lose all faith that the sun will ever rise again. But you see, in those moments, I think we have to be reminded that Jesus is always with us. All of us have faced dark moments, moments when we get the diagnosis from the doctor of an illness that we never wanted to face, and now we're in the middle of facing it. Moments when people who we love and cherish so deeply hurt us so much that we don't know if we can ever move on and forgive them. Moments when our work seems to just betray us or overcome us. Moments when the bank statements don't seem to match up. There are so many dark moments in our lives where we can doubt if the light is ever going to win. But I think even in those dark moments, there's so much we can learn about who Jesus is and who we are. Because even in the darkest moment of human history that we saw here in John 19, even in these darkest moments, there's still much that God teaches us about who Jesus is and who we are. So I want to look at those 2 questions I asked. Who is Jesus and who are we? Who is Jesus? Would you remember when Judas came to Jesus in the garden and Jesus asked, "Who are you looking for?" And they responded, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus said, "I am he." Who is Jesus? Jesus is Jesus of Nazareth. He's this ordinary rabbi who traveled around from Nazareth, who kept telling people about who God is and what it's like to follow after God. Jesus is Jesus of Nazareth, who turned water into wine at that wedding in Cana of Galilee, who talked to Nicodemus late at night about being born again, who healed that lame man by the side of the pool. Jesus, who even washed the feet of Judas, who he knew who would betray him. Who is Jesus? Jesus is the perfect man who showed us what it's like to live a life in full and complete and total obedience to God. Jesus shows us what it's like to live in God's will. And Jesus is who we must model our lives after. Who is Jesus? Well, Jesus, remember when he was talking with Pilate and those religious leaders? Jesus is the Son of God. So Jesus isn't just this amazing man, this traveling rabbi. Jesus is both fully human and fully divine. That Jesus is God who would leave the comforts of heaven to come down, to experience the fullness of what we encounter in this human life, to put on flesh and skin and bones and live and breathe among us. Who is Jesus? Jesus is the clearest picture of who God is. And so if we want to know about who God is, then we just have to look to Jesus. Who is Jesus? Remember that sign that Pilate had made to post it above Jesus' head that said in 3 languages, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Who is Jesus? Jesus is not just the King of the Jews. Jesus is the King of the world. That is why those three languages were so significant, because it meant that every single person, not just the Jews, but every single person who walked by Jesus on that cross and saw the sign posted above his head, everyone could read what it said, that this man is the King of the Jews. That when this man was lifted up on a cross, he would draw all people to himself, that he would be the Savior of the world, who is Jesus, the King of the world, the Savior, the light of the world. That even in the darkness, there is so much that we can learn about who Jesus is. Then we have to ask that second question, who are we? And I'm going to be honest with you, the answer to this question is not as pretty as the answer to Jesus. Because the picture that's painted of humanity in these two chapters is kind of bleak, and it's not that hopeful. In fact, if we look at these two chapters, we can see that there is a long list of betrayers in these two chapters. As we journeyed with Jesus through the darkness, we saw Jesus handed off from Judas to Annas to Caiaphas. Peter denied Jesus, and Pilate, the religious leaders, and eventually the soldiers who crucified him. And so if we ask, who are we, in light of these two passages, the picture for us can look kind of dreary. And we might just think, well, we're just our betrayers of Jesus, just one more person on this long list of betrayers who have denied and rejected and abandoned Jesus. And we can begin to think this about ourselves and begin to lose hope. But before we feel too bleak about who we are, I want to share one more passage with you this morning. This passage occurs in John 19, verse 25. It's right after Pilate has that sign posted above Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, and right before Jesus says, "It is finished." Right in between those two events, this passage occurs. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And then he said to this disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. In the middle of this story, where it just seems like Jesus is handed over from one betrayer to the next, there's this brief moment of hope. Because when everyone else had denied, betrayed, rejected Jesus, had fled and abandoned him, 5 people, 5 faithful followers remained with Jesus and stood with him at the cross. That in the darkest night, when everyone else had chosen to deny Jesus, 5 faithful followers remained. And I don't think it was easy for them. They were probably spit on and ridiculed as they walked that road with Jesus toward the cross. But they were willing to follow Jesus until the very end. And they realized that in the darkest night, they have a choice. That they could have chosen to deny and betray and abandon Jesus. Or they could choose to follow Jesus to the very end. We this morning have the same choice. That in the darkest nights in our lives that we experience, we have a choice of how we respond, of who we are. We can choose to add ourselves to the long list of the people who betrayed Jesus, or we can choose to faithfully follow Jesus until the very end. Those disciples who followed Jesus were willing to risk everything, to give it their all, to follow Jesus because they loved him that much. That they could see his love on display for the world and realize that when they followed Jesus, they too had to be willing to give up life itself, the thing that we hold most precious, to be willing to give that up for the sake of the world. That they'd be willing to love without limits, to give without counting, that's what it would look like to follow Jesus until the very end. It's not easy to follow Jesus. In fact, Jesus doesn't promise us that it's going to be an easy life to follow him. In fact, Jesus promises us that we will face trials and trouble and persecution in this world. But we have a choice. That when we experience darkness, how will we respond? Will we cling to our faith and our hope in Jesus, or will we reject and deny him? And so this morning, I wanted to share a story from someone of our congregation who recently experienced her own journey through darkness. Sammy graciously came in this week and talked with me about her journey through cancer, of what she learned about Jesus and about herself as she journeyed through this dark time in her life. So I'm going to play a clip from our time together for us to hear a glimpse of Sammy's story.
Well, Sammy, thanks for coming in today to share some of your story with us. And so I would love to just start by asking to tell us what it was like when you first found out that you had cancer.
Kind of shocking. They think I had it for 2 years, but I waited a little bit just to find out, to go to the doctor actually. And then I guess it really didn't hit me until he called and said that it was aggressive, and I had to start chemo as soon as we got back from Hawaii. So that was kind of the shocking point then. Because before, okay, I might have to have chemo, I might have to do radiation or nothing. But then all of a sudden, I had to start as soon as we got back. So that's kind of, I don't want to say disappointing, but kind of shocking, very shocking, yeah.
So you began your chemo treatments, and then as you kind of walked this journey of having cancer, what would you say was the darkest moment in your journey?
I really don't. I mean, I had some bad days and where I would just cry at my house, but it really, I don't know that I really had dark. I think it probably was when I had to shave my head actually. So it really wasn't the actual cancer itself. It was the drugs that were going to help cancer. So I think that was probably the worst day. I mean, like I said, I had bad days before, but it was. I think that was needed the realization, like it was happening. So, but, yeah.
And so as you walked this journey of cancer, what did you learn about Jesus, and what did you learn about yourself?
That he's always there. I never really doubted through the journey that I had that he wasn't going to help. I mean, obviously the drugs and everything help, but he's always there no matter day or night, and I really didn't doubt through the entire. I mean, I had days again where I doubted things, but I really didn't question him as to why this was happening. So, and then I guess for me, what I learned about myself is that I'm stronger than what I thought I was, which obviously me, but I mean, there's so many people praying that it was unbelievable. It was just crazy about how many people were praying for me, and I mean, I don't know, other than the fact that I that's really, I mean, if there isn't a God, then if you don't have God, then you don't have anything. Material things aren't anything unless you have Him. Again, you're going to falter. I falter more now, after really, than during different things. But He's always going to be there. So.
Thank you, Sammy, so much for sharing this. Your story with us. Thank you for walking with us.
I think Sammy said it so perfectly, that when we are facing difficult times in our lives, that we have to still believe. That in the darkest moments of our lives, we have a choice. That we can betray or deny or abandon our faith and relationship with Jesus, or can believe. We can cling tightly to Jesus and follow Him until the very end. The choice of how we respond is up to us. But I believe that only in being willing to follow Jesus, no matter where that may take us, that is the only way that we'll be able to have